In 2024, the first deep-sea horror movie, Gods of the Deep, will bring a shocking experience. Friends with a timid heart must call their buddies to watch together, because the horror elements in this movie have been completely maxed out. Not only does it have the oppression and suffocation of the deep sea at 10,000 meters, but also nameless Cthulhu monsters. The story takes place somewhere in the South Atlantic Ocean. While conducting deep-sea exploration, a scientific expedition team from a company called Pickman accidentally discovered ruins left by a suspected intelligent life at a depth of 11,000 kilometers on the seabed using a remote-controlled probe. The peculiar shape looks like a stone door. What exactly is behind the door? Are its builders extraterrestrial visitors or an unknown civilization in the deep sea? There are too many mysteries for them to unravel, so Pickman Company decided to put together an expedition team to go and investigate. As the person in charge of this project, the first person Julia thought of was Jim, an astrobiology scientist, because Jim's father also worked for Pickman Company. He was also an outstanding astrobiology scientist, but unfortunately passed away due to an accident during a mission. It was precisely because of this that Jim had a strong aversion to the company and had no intention of accepting their invitation. But as soon as he saw the video they captured from the deep sea, the curious Jim immediately changed his mind. After all, as an astrobiology scientist, he also wanted to know what was really behind the door. In addition to Jim, there were a few other people on this expedition team. They were Christine, a marine biologist; Joe, a safety officer and communications officer; Gordon, a submersible pilot; and Hank, a mechanical engineer. In order to successfully dive into the deep sea, Pickman Company even specially spent 2.5 months building a deep-sea submersible at a huge cost. It is currently the world's most advanced deep diving equipment, made with the latest and most durable synthetic materials. It can withstand the enormous water pressure at a depth of 11,000 kilometers and safely take them to their destination. Although Hank repeatedly emphasized the safety of the submersible and it had already undergone multiple test dives, Christine still felt worried. After all, it was a depth that humans had never reached before. At this point, the company's founder Jed suddenly said he had spent his entire life exploring the unknown and incomprehensible. This ancient ruin was their greatest discovery ever and could very likely overturn all of humanity's existing knowledge. If this ruin was indeed built by intelligent beings, then it meant there truly existed another world in a different location in the ocean. The things inside must also be worth taking risks for and might be able to unravel the secrets of the ocean. As the discoverers of this secret, they would all be remembered by the world. At the same time, to allay everyone's concerns, Jed would personally accompany the expedition team into the deep sea. Upon hearing this, everyone thought it made sense and agreed one after another. After 2.5 months of training, the expedition team arrived at the exploration base located in Antarctica. Then, via a small boat, they successfully boarded the deep-sea submersible. This submersible only had a 20-hour oxygen supply, and it would take an hour just to reach the seabed, so their time was very tight. As soon as they entered the submersible, they immediately headed for the deep sea. Soon, the submersible reached the seabed at a depth of 11,000 kilometers, breaking the world record for the deepest human dive. The moment the image appeared, that mysterious ruin was starkly visible before their eyes. If they weren't observing it up close, they never would have imagined this thing was actually so huge. The circular entrance in the middle could almost fit a villa. There was no time to marvel. The expedition team resolutely entered the interior. However, an accident occurred. The submersible suddenly shook non-stop due to some kind of interference. Then an unknown creature flashed past their eyes. When the submersible stabilized, they discovered the thrusters had malfunctioned and all the equipment had failed. At the same time, they also lost contact with the control center at the base. Because they had lost power, the submersible kept sinking. At this rate, it might not be able to withstand the pressure. But just as everyone was at a loss, the power suddenly came back on. When they regained contact with the control center, they were told they had been out of contact for a full 3 hours. Everyone was stunned. They had clearly only entered here a short while ago. How could 3 hours have passed? But when Hank checked the life support system, he was surprised to find that it had indeed been running for 4 hours. Just as everyone was puzzled, a giant ancient ruin suddenly appeared before their eyes. It was formed by countless gigantic stones, each one almost as big as a mountain. But how could there possibly be intelligent life in such an environment? At this point, Gordon suddenly noticed something in the seabed below. Upon closer inspection, it turned out to be the remains of a giant creature. Who would have thought there really were life forms here? Jed can't wait to order Jim to hurry up and extract the sample. He wanted to bring it back for careful study. Jed's confident demeanor seemed as if he had long anticipated this. Soon, Jim set off in a small submarine. As the submarine gradually approached, the shape of the giant creature slowly came into view. The immensity of the giant creature was simply beyond imagination. Just its eyes were as big as the submarine. Jim instantly felt overwhelmingly hopeless. Just as he began collecting samples, the giant creature suddenly moved. They never thought this thing was actually still alive. Seeing this, Christine, worried that something would go wrong, wanted to tell Jim to return immediately, but Joe stopped him from doing so. After all, they were only one step away from success. They couldn't return empty-handed. Finally, before the monster fully awakened, Jim successfully obtained the samples, but on the way back, the submarine malfunctioned just like before. While losing power, it also completely lost contact with the deep-sea submersible. It seemed to be some kind of electromagnetic interference emitted by the monster again, and by this time, the monster had fully awakened. Seeing this, Christine wanted to go rescue Jim, but Gordon, afraid of being affected, refused to go. Unexpectedly, Joe suddenly grabbed the controller, because he had to get the samples back as instructed by Jed. At the same time, Christine also came to the cabin, ready to open the hatch at any time. However, as soon as the deep-sea submersible was about to approach, the monster suddenly launched an attack. Although Gordon managed to control the submersible to escape at the critical moment, they still suffered a considerable impact, causing a leak in one of the cabins. Hank hurried over to make repairs, but unexpectedly, the volume of water was too great and trapped him inside. For the safety of the entire submersible, Jed, separated by a hatch, didn't choose to save him. He watched Hank drown alive. But fortunately, at this moment, Jim's submarine regained power. After putting some distance between them and the monster, he hurriedly made contact with Gordon. He then successfully piloted the submarine back safely. He also brought back the samples he had extracted. The moment they drove out of the cave, everyone breathed a sigh of relief, and that monster didn't chase after them. But just as everyone thought the crisis was over, Gordon delivered some bad news. Because of the water in the cabin, the submersible was overloaded. What originally would have taken only an hour to return to the surface might now take an extra 2 hours. Even worse, the life support system showed that the oxygen supply was only just enough to last for 3 hours. It seemed that because time passed too quickly inside the cave, their planned 20 hours simply wasn't enough. Moreover, water was still rushing into the cabin. This meant that the longer the submersible stayed in the water, the slower its ascent speed would be. At this point, their only choice was to leave it to fate. Just then, a strange sound suddenly came. The samples Jim brought back had actually started moving. Worried that there might be some unknown virus inside, Jim and Christine felt the samples should be sealed and isolated. But when Jed arrived, he told Joe to take the samples to the lab immediately. He wanted to start studying them right away. After all, Jed is the boss. Jim and Christine cannot say much, but for safety reasons they still followed to the laboratory. They never imagined that this clump of tissue, completely separated from the monster, could still move. If they could unravel its secrets, it would undoubtedly be a breakthrough for human biology. Suddenly, a tentacle extended from the squirming sample. It seemed to be an entity with its own independent consciousness. Seeing this, Christine and Jim once again suggested isolating it and waiting until they returned to the base to study it. Seeing Jed still stubbornly refusing to listen, for the safety of the entire expedition team, Jim had no choice but to forcibly take Jed away. Christine then closed the lab door. On the other side, Joe opened a computer and secretly communicated with Julia at the base. It turned out they knew the monster sample was invaluable, so they planned to take it back behind Jed's back and sell it for a good price. Little did they know, Jed had heard their conversation loud and clear. Unlike them, Jed's obsession with the monster had reached a perverted level. When he secretly returned to the lab to continue his research, he discovered the sample had mutated and burst open the glass container. Seeing this, Jed seemed to have lost his mind. He couldn't resist making direct contact with the sample. Not long after, Gordon in the cockpit was attacked. Hearing the commotion, Jim and Christine hurried over to check. Seeing the lab door had been opened, Christine sensed something was wrong. She walked over and saw that the sample had grown enormous. Christine wanted to close the door again, but inadvertently touched an unknown mucus on the keypad lock. She didn't think much of it and hurried to Jim's side. Then she saw Jed walk out of the cockpit, but he seemed a bit off. With a roar, Jed resolutely jumped into the seawater through the hatch. It seemed that after contacting the sample, he had mutated. They wanted to save him, but were stopped by Joe, who came running.
Are you just gonna let Pikmin die in there?
This was his dream, to see those creatures, those ancient sea gods, and if that's what he wants, I do not need to go down with him.
Only then did Jim and Christine finally realize they had been tricked by the company. In fact, the company had long known what was in the ruins. The company's goal from the start was to extract samples from the monster's body. It's just that unlike the perverted Jed, Joe and Julia's motive was simply money. An agitated Joe warned them not to try to stop him, or else he wouldn't be polite. However, Christine told him the sample in the lab had mutated. The power of this kind of monster had exceeded their control. Not only was the monster's body very strong, it also seemed capable of psychic attacks on the brain. The skeptical Joe insisted on checking. As soon as he entered the lab, he felt dizzy, but he still persisted in using a knife to take some tissue. Jim and Christine went to the cockpit and found Gordon had also changed. He had obviously been infected by the mutated Jed. Gordon's distorted body looked very bizarre. Before they could react, Gordon directly pounced on Jim beside him, while snatching away the axe. Gordon also pushed Jim down, with the axe in hand. Gordon didn't attack Christine, but kept smashing the control panel. It seemed he wanted to leave everyone in the deep sea, although Joe arrived in time and stopped Gordon with a gun. This submersible was obviously ruined. It would soon be unable to withstand the pressure and implode, and the submarine could only hold 2 people. There was no way they could all leave. Joe wanted to take the samples and escape alone in the submersible, but Christine picked up an axe on the ground and knocked the weapon out of his hand. They instantly started fighting. Without a weapon, Joe was quickly beaten to the ground and Christine directly crippled one of his legs. At this point, Jim, who had fallen unconscious, also woke up. Christine hurriedly lowered the submarine, ready to take Jim and leave immediately. But before leaving, Jim wanted to destroy those samples. After all, something so terrifying, if it accidentally appeared in the human world, would definitely trigger a huge disaster. However, they didn't know that a horrible thing was happening in the cockpit at this time. A tentacle suddenly drilled out of Gordon's corpse and attacked the immobilized Joe, just as Jim burned all the samples and returned to Christine's side. Ready to escape together, Joe, parasitized by the tentacle, suddenly appeared carrying an axe. Jim knew that at this rate, neither of them would be able to leave, so he decisively pressed the button to release the submarine into the seawater, buying Christine a chance to survive. Then, as soon as Jim picked up the weapon from the ground to fight back, he was knocked away again by Joe with the axe. Jim had no choice but to run. After escaping Joe's pursuit, Jim hurriedly picked up the weapon from the ground and shot at him like crazy. Jim slowly approached the fallen Joe, only to find that the tentacle in his body wasn't dead, so he decisively shot and completely killed this monster. Everything was finally over. However, Jim himself could only sit there and quietly await the arrival of death. At this time, Christine had already safely left. When she woke up from her coma, she found she had been rescued by the company's people. She also learned from Julia that the submersible had imploded, and Jim had been buried in the sea. Faced with this deceiver who stopped at nothing for money, Christine was left with only anger. But suddenly, she felt something was wrong with her body. It seemed something wanted to bore out of her abdomen. Thinking of the unknown mucus she touched at the lab door, Christine finally realized she had also been parasitized. Then a monster burst out of her body, splattering blood all over Julia's face. Who would have thought that even Jim's sacrifice still couldn't prevent the disaster from happening?